We're going to start in just a minute. If I could just ask everybody, hey Siri, set my phone to vibrate. So if you could all just check that your phones are all set to silent, then turn to the person next to you. Make sure their phone is set to silent. Now, I'm sure that Christy has a really good ear. She'll be able to point out the person who the phone rings. That's a skill that musicians might have, so you probably don't want to have her point to the person next to you, and people will think that she's pointing at you. So just check that everybody's phone is set quiet, and we'll start the program in just a second. I think there's a couple more people coming in, and then we'll get started. Good afternoon. I am Ellie Meierfeld, the CEO of the Zekelman Holocaust Center, and I wonder if there are a few of you that are here to escape the heat in our air-conditioned space, but I hope you'll join the rest of us in welcoming you to this afternoon's performance of Refuge and Resistance about the defiant and controlling role of music during the Holocaust with our guest flautist, Christine Beard. I want to thank the Burton A. Zipser and Sandra D. Zipser Foundation for its lead support for today's performance and for its commitment to learning in the areas of music and cultural enrichment. I also thank our supporters, Nancy and Leonard Berry, Robin and Leo Eisenberg, Lynn Kalish, Sandra Martin Nessel, and Fanna Mark Newman, as well as the PNC Foundation for its continuing support for our programming. And we also appreciate the support of our community partner, the Detroit Chamber Winds and Strings. Our presenter today is Christine Beard, who first picked up the flute in 7th grade. Today, Christy is a professor of flute and international studies at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, teaching chamber music and contemporary music literature. She also enjoys an international career as a sought-out soloist whose performances reveal the deep, soulful, expressive powers of the flute, and as a side hobby, also the piccolo. She collaborates frequently with composers around the world while also curating programs close to home at the university's Samuel Bach Museum and Learning Center. That center is named for artist and Holocaust survivor Samuel Bach, whose largest collection of artwork is housed there. It's a hub for educational remembrance and dialogue. And through its array of cultural programming, their center offers a path to understanding difficult historical subject matter, and it's a space to realize the promise of a hope for a better society. For today's program, I think that usually music is a source of joy for the players and the audiences, but during the Holocaust, music was both a form of torture, but also an expression of resistance. For Christy, the role of music during the Holocaust is also a source of her ongoing research, and today, she'll bring to our ears and to our hearts the stories of victims who composed music for flute under the worst of circumstances. As Christy notes, it is astounding to think that anyone could be creative during such duress. We are in for an inspiring afternoon. We'll learn together from the lives of the composers that we meet. Christy.
Thank you so much for having me. This is my first time at this museum here in the Detroit area, and I am blown away by the way that the exhibit here has been curated to focus on the survivors and the journey of hope. So if you haven't had a chance to check out the exhibit before this afternoon and you don't have time today, be sure to come back and see it because they've worked really hard to give you a wonderful historical presentation with a different narrative. For those of you that are in the audience that maybe this is your first time studying the Holocaust or taking a tour of the history of the Holocaust, I will just point out what most of us already know, that the Holocaust is a systematic state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators between 1933 and 45 across Europe and North Africa. The Nazis believed that Germans were racially superior, and they believed Jews were a threat to the so-called German racial community. And while Jews were the primary victims, the Nazis also targeted other groups for persecution and murder, including Roma, people with disabilities, some Slavic peoples, and black people, who they all considered to be biologically inferior. The regime persecuted other groups because of politics, ideology, or behavior. And these groups included communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, gay men, and people the Nazis called asocials and professional criminals. And if they didn't have a title to put on anybody, they just called them degenerates. So anybody who fell into that category was a degenerate. The Holocaust also could not have happened without the creative or passive participation of millions of people. Some people recognized that they could personally benefit from the persecution and murder of Jews, and they acquired the property or homes of Jews who were deported and murdered. Some took over the businesses of Jews forced to immigrate or sent to concentration camps, and others found jobs in the Nazi regime. These jobs gave them money, political power, and influence. And in countries that Germany invaded, many collaborators saw the benefit of assisting their new leaders, and they chose to denounce their Jewish neighbors. My hope by giving this presentation at museums and schools and public libraries and other institutions across the country and actually around the world is to point out that these things are still happening today and that each of us can play a role, whether it be small or a big role, in pointing out atrocities that are happening right next door to us, perhaps even our own households, and to do something about it, to empower people to be the person who creates change, even if it's just a small change within your own community. So I like to start off this presentation by talking about my own education about the Holocaust as a professional musician. And for this, I'm going to switch to this other microphone if I can get it on. Yes. So I hate being tied behind the podium. So this picture, does anybody in the audience happen to know who this gentleman is that's standing front and center in this picture? This is the famous French composer Olivier Messiaen. And this is the only thing that most musicians going through college education are taught about the Holocaust, is that Messiaen was put into the role of a nurse during World War II, and he was pretty quickly captured and put into a camp. And they soon discovered upon his arrest that the only thing he had on his person was a pad and paper and pencil and some manuscript paper, some little doodlings of music, and they discovered that they had a very famous musician in their midst. But his experience in a POW camp is quite different than those, the Jews who were sent to the ghettos and the concentration camps. But this was our only education that we received throughout all of my 3 degrees of music studies, is that this happened, and that his most famous work was written during his time at the POW camp, which is entitled The Quartet for the End of Time. And it was written for the musicians that he had available to him at that POW camp. And you see them here. Messiaen was a pianist, and then we have a violinist, a cellist, and a clarinet. So that was the instrumentation for this extremely famous work that is still performed widely today and is still kind of the staple of music as an example of music that was composed during the Holocaust. But again, his experience being in a POW camp was a lot more privileged than the experiences of Jews who were put into the ghettos and the concentration camps. So I'll talk a little bit about those differences as we're going through this presentation. I wanted to speak Sorry, I guess I'm going to switch back and forth just a little bit here. I wanted to speak about the differences of decisions that people made during World War II. As I said in my introduction, a lot of people chose to just give in and bow down to the SS regulations, the Nazi regulations that were being imposed on them, and actually be active participants. So we have two different examples of conductors who were prominent in the world during World War II. And the first one up top, his name is Furtwängler. He was a German conductor and the famed conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. And he gave in to the SS regulations by complying with the orders to not perform Jewish music, to dismiss the Jewish musicians from his orchestra. And because of that, he was labeled the devil's music master. And it took him decades after the war to regain his prominence as a conductor. And most people who chose that path to, give into what was happening in the world around them never regained their prominence. The readings that I've done on him have shown that there is some evidence that he was actually working behind the scenes to try to help some of the the Jewish musicians. But it took him a long time to dig himself out of that persona. On the opposite side of the spectrum, the picture below is Marius Flutist, who is a Dutch composer and orchestral conductor of the Concertgebouw Orchestra. But he was fired from his position because he refused to comply with the SS regulations and would not dismiss the Jewish musicians and not stop performing the music that was written by Jewish composers. After he was fired, he eventually was arrested for his resistance work and imprisoned in Camp Wood. Oh, wrong way. I did it. I actually pressed the wrong one. They told me I would back there. So, green button. It's very large. All right. So, in Camp Wood, he met two other musicians. We see at the top right the flutist, whose name, I make sure that I have all my names correct here. Edvard van Rooyen, who, as you see, his dates there, 1913 to 1987. All of these musicians fortunately made it out alive, but all three of these musicians were arrested and imprisoned in Camp Wood for their various acts of resistance and in trying to help their Jewish musician friends avoid capture and arrest. Some of them also going so far as to faking papers for their friends and that sort of thing. Van Rooyen was gainfully employed as a musician and flutist who was arrested for his resistance work, and he used his home as a transit for Jewish people going into hiding. He also learned to make fingerprints and to fake documents, and then after the war, he returned to life as a professional musician and academic, although he had a lot of physical disability following his imprisonment because of the conditions under which he lived. Peter Dolk was arrested in December 16th of 1942 for having given preferential treatment to Jews. He had assisted Jewish musicians who had played a crucial role in his own musical development. And during a trip to one of his hiding places, he was shadowed and then informed against, resulting in his arrest. This drawing is, for me as a flutist, one of the most valuable artifacts that I have ran across in my research, and it was used in the promotional materials here at the museum. This is actually a drawing that was done by a fellow prisoner at the camp, Ari Emmons, which depicts the flutist Edvard van Rooyen there in the upper left-hand corner, and he's performing a piece that was written by Flutist, who I just spoke of a minute ago, who's pictured at the piano. This was his premiere of a new flute sonata for flute and piano at Camp Wood that was performed April 2nd, 1944. A week later, Flutist wrote another piece for Edvard that was a birthday present for him entitled Obeyed, that was for solo flute. And so even though this drawing isn't specifically of that performance, it's still probably in the same space that this solo piece was written. It's obviously for the same flutist, and many of the same prisoners would have been in the room during the premiere of this performance of the Obeyed for solo flute. And I'm going to perform it for you just to give you a sense of what this music was like and what was happening at this point in time at this camp. After the performance was given, they had broadcasted over the speakers for the entire camp to hear, and they had at this camp the women and the men separated. So once the women's dormitories heard this performance over the loudspeakers, they then responded spontaneously with a chorus of what was it? It just went right out of my head. Ave Maria is what they sang in response to this. So this piece is going to be the Obeyed for solo flute by the Dutch composer Marius Vloothuis. So this picture is at an exhibition in Dusseldorf from 1938 that was entitled Degenerate Music. And the overall theme of this exhibition was defamation of contemporary American music, such as Negro music, and other Jewish plot upon German culture. Let me say that again. As another Jewish plot upon German culture. Nazi criticisms of jazz music included gratuitous use of syncopation and orgies of drums and the corruption seed in the musical expression with indecent dance forms. And you can see in this painting or in this photo that we have a poster of jazz musicians there, and everybody's sitting on benches and standing around studying this subject matter. The SS cultural purification, as you can see, some of the goals were to form the formation of the Culture Camera to oversee all culture and arts events, the rejection of music and art that was not classical, white, or in the German tradition, any music that was avant-garde and experimental music that wasn't in the German tradition, any non-Germanic folk music, jazz music or black music, anything that didn't fall into those categories, they just labeled as degenerate music, and of course the banning of Jewish musicians and Jewish music. One of the things that I particularly am drawn to as I'm doing this research is, of course, the music, but also some of the artwork and iconography that was used during the time as propaganda, and this is, of course, one that's tied to music specifically. Cartoons and caricatures were an important part of Nazi propaganda. Caricatures also always depicted Jews as the Nazi stereotype: short, fat, ugly, unshaven, drooling, sexually perverted, bent noses with pig-like eyes. This shows how caricatures worked to the advantage of the Nazi Party, allowing them to portray what they wanted in such a way which photographs could not. A photograph would show you the Jewish person as a human being, whereas caricatures meant that the Nazi Party could portray Jews in an inhumane and cartoon form. The cartoons intended to spread the widespread support for a Nazi ideology, and in this case, anti-Americanism. This poster was used in the exhibit of the 1938 Degenerate Music exhibit in Dusseldorf. And the overall theme of the exhibition was the defamation of contemporary American music as Negro music and another plot upon German culture. As you can see in this drawing, this caricature, this character who was known at the time as Johnny has been turned into a monkey with large earrings, and instead of having the boutonniere with the carnation, it has the Jewish star. Everything that they could possibly over-characterize, over-dramatize about features was done in this depiction. Let's see, on the events, it was used as the events cover brochure and mutated into a monkey. What else? It would become a prominent figure within the Nazi propaganda and the symbol of what was known as degenerate music throughout the entirety of World War II. Another interesting piece of propaganda that has some musical tones in it is this one, Liberators 1944. Culture terror, the USA will save European culture from ruin. And it was done by the Norwegian artist Harold Damsleth, who was a member of the Nazi Party, or excuse me, the Fascist Party in Norway. And some of the detail of this monstrous atrocity I want to zero in on, especially those of which are having to do with music specifically. So if we look at the top in closer detail, we see, of course, the American flag, grand old flag, being waved backwards, which is probably no small error. And then we have the beauty pageant, who's very scantily dressed, again, a nod to the culture here in the United States and some of the musical shows that were taking place during the time. We have the Native American playing the trumpet with the record behind him, kind of symbolizing popular music of the time. And then in the middle of the body here, we have a cage of two black figures who have been made to look very primitive and dancing in some primitive way. So again, giving a nod to the idea that jazz is a bad art form. We also have a nod to the things that were happening here in the United States at the time. Part of this propaganda is to wave the finger at the United States and say, how dare you tell us what we should be doing with our population and the people in our country when you are still hanging black people and having your own racial issues in the United States. And we have that with the noose that's hanging here on the side, as well as just having the black figures in the cage as well. If we go down to the bottom of the figure, yes, there's no questioning why they put the Jewish star in the location of the body, that they decided to put this. And then we have, of course, the bombs as legs that are going through Europe and destroying what they are saying is their culture. And that's what the sign says, is that the USA shall save European culture from destruction, kind of tongue-in-cheek. And you see the Statue of Liberty in the background as well. So what was the role of music in the camps and ghettos? Very, very point blank, the Nazi guards and officers were bored, and a lot of times they just wanted entertainment. And when they discovered that they had world-class musicians amongst their ranks, amongst the ghettos and the camps, then they would force them to perform for them just at any time of day, whether it was morning, evening, night, in the middle of the night, and wake them from their sleep and force them to perform at their whim. They also used them as marching music for the workers to go to and from their daily duties at the camps and to give some type of a cadence, and possibly also to help boost the morale of the workers as they were going to and from their duties. They used the musicians for ceremonial performances, especially when officers and other high dignitaries were visiting these places. It became a status symbol for the Nazi officials in charge of each camp and ghetto of having, what they wanted to be the best orchestra or the best band or the best musical group that they knew of from reports from other places. And of course, they used music as a psychological and emotional torture for creating a false sense of safety or comfort. These musicians were forced to play for a lot of different types of atrocities that were happening. You can see in the photo here on the upper right-hand side, musicians that are marching in front of this cart that is pulling a prisoner to their death or their execution. So knowing that you're having to perform music for, somebody to be murdered. They also used it for sorting platforms, which I don't have a photo of. I've been researching, trying to find something that depicts musicians on these platforms, and I'm hopeful that I'll find one at some point. But at Auschwitz, there were several orchestras, and they would have them on the platform while the trains were arriving, and it kind of created this false sense of security for the people who were arriving, but it also kind of created a distraction so that they heard the music, they felt like they were in a safe place or felt somewhat comforted, but the musicians knew from which direction they were being sent, which ones were going to survive or go to work, and which ones were going straight to their death. They also used it for gas chamber executions to lead people to the gas chambers, as well as any type of executions that were happening. And some of the discussions that I've had when giving this lecture is that as a classically trained musician, I am very personally tied to my performances. It's an emotional experience for me. And it's very hard for me to fathom being able to use my craft and my artistry for this purpose. without completely breaking down and possibly, losing my sense of humanity. And there were certainly musicians that couldn't do this, and they stopped composing during this time period, or they put their instruments away and never played them again. And I can totally empathize or sympathize with that. But it's just really hard for me to imagine being able to do that under these circumstances. But they did, and many of them were saved because of the fact that they could separate their musicianship from what the circumstances were around them. And we'll hear from a musician later in the presentation from her directly about how that worked for her. For the prisoners, the music could be an act of defiance or resistance to their captors. It was also a form of escape for them to, get away from the hell that they were living in at that moment and get back to a place of serenity and something that comforted them. And it was also a way for the prisoners to hold on to their own humanity. And again, this doesn't go for everybody, but the ones that were able to separate their emotional being with their artistic person and could do this and use it as a way to survive is, to me, very incredible. One of the questions that I get very often is how did the musicians get instruments into these places? Because most of the time they were banned, especially from the very beginning of the Holocaust. They weren't allowed to bring a lot of personal effects with them. But for many musicians, our instruments are the most important thing aside from our family that we have. And so I've read many stories of how musicians would actually dismantle their instruments. For instance, cello. I read this one story, and a cello is probably about this tall if you're just standing next to it. Probably the neck even comes a little higher than that. But there was a story of somebody who had cut apart their cello and sewed it into the seams of their coat, and then they got to the camp that they were being sent to and reconstructed the instrument so that they would have it to play, because that was their sense of comfort and their sense of humanity. So they went to big lengths in a lot of these circumstances to get the instruments in. However, as I said before, when the guards were bored and they realized they had musicians in their ranks, sometimes they would supply instruments to them. Sometimes they were able to be bribed to allow instruments to come in from the outside, depending on the situation. It was different in every single camp and every single ghetto, but this is how this started to come about. And then very often the instruments would be left behind when they were transferred or when they were sent to execution, and then the next person would come into that camp or ghetto and then pick it up and have that instrument to play. There are places across the world who have some of the instruments that were performed in these spaces, but there's not very many that survived. This is an example of a program that was performed actually it's the program that was performed in that painting that I showed you earlier at the camp that Floathouse was at. And this was the program in which his sonata for flute and piano was premiered. And so another question that I get is what type of music was performed during this time period by the Jewish musicians in the camps and the ghettos? And the answer to that is that they performed everything. They performed classical masterpieces, most of which bulk of our repertoire is from German composers. So you see a lot of German composers listed on this program: Telemann, Haydn, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, all Germans. The Jewish prisoners in these camps and ghettos were Germans. The majority of them were Germans, and they considered themselves to be German. They had no qualms with continuing to play music by German composers. They just were also Jewish and were being persecuted for that. But they saw no issues with continuing to play the heart of our repertoire, which at that time, and really still is, by German composers. There are some other ones that you see listed as well. Claude Debussy was a up-and-coming composer during that time. his famous Syrinx for solo flute is one of our staples in the repertoire. And then, of course, we have listed here at the bottom the sonata for flute and piano, which was the world premiere that he wrote during the camp, and by which that painting, that drawing was made. So the next thing that I want to discuss is Theresienstadt. Yes. Have to get to my select slide. Oh, I totally skipped over here. So Theresienstadt was the camp, or the ghetto, excuse me, at which many famous artists and musicians and writers and scholars were sent initially, because they couldn't just disappear those people without the world noticing. And so they were sent, a lot of them were sent to Theresienstadt, and they created this false civilization for them to live, and fooled the world into thinking that the Jewish people were being treated well by creating this false community with, so far as to see the false fronts on the buildings that made them all look very nice, having their own currency, having their own mail system. They put together a propaganda video, which I'll show you a little bit of it in a moment, showing all of the great things that they were able to do while living here in Theresienstadt, from working in the fields to learning how to sew to cobbling shoes and doing woodworking and metalsmithing and playing football, or not football, soccer. We call it football here. Anyway, soccer and all of the things. They even had the orchestra there as well. And so you'll see all of these things. I have the entire copy of the propaganda video, and it's an interesting watch if you are willing to watch it. What I find most fascinating, and when we get to that, I'll point it out, is kind of seeing the looks on everybody's faces as you are watching the video, because many of them, obviously none of them wanted to be there, and you can see that there's a lot of hollowness and sadness and anger in their eyes. But Theresienstadt was the perfect setup for them to fool the world. The Red Cross came in to inspect it, and they were also fooled just like everybody else, thinking that this is actually an okay place for them to move all the Jewish people to and to have a life. And of course, that wasn't the truth. So as I mentioned, they did have orchestras and things to do. Let's see if I can get to the same slide here. Having trouble with my notes here. Apologize. Let me get to the same place. I can talk off the cuff, but I tend to start going on tangents quite a bit. So there we go. All right, so the prisoners here at Theresienstadt, as you see in this photo, we have a jazz band that was in existence. The upper drawing is kind of symbolic of the conditions under which many of the people were living in Theresienstadt. They were in cramped quarters. This is some type of a larger space where there's a piano, but there's missing legs, and it's propped up on boxes, and I can only imagine how horrible it sounded, because it probably wasn't tuned in 10 years, and probably had missing keys. And then we have a prayer group or something like that going on here on the left-hand side going on. So very cramped conditions, very dirty conditions. And then here at the bottom, we have a depiction of a performance of Verdi's Requiem Mass. And this particular Mass was something that was performed 16 times at Theresienstadt. The prisoners at Theresienstadt saw that the Requiem's Dies Irae movement, its text has powerful imagery of divine judgment, and it was a way for them to express their defiance and a message to the Nazis that their actions would not go unpunished. And when the Red Cross came, they performed this for the Red Cross, hoping that they would see through the message that they were trying to get across. But of course they didn't. They just thought it was a beautiful performance of the Requiem, and they left amazed, thinking that this was a wonderful place for the Jewish people to be. And then unfortunately, after the performances were done, many times half the chorus would be sent someplace else, many times to their death, and they would have new people come in, and they'd have to retrain them to perform the Requiem over and over again, which is why it was done 16 times. They were constantly training new people to sing it. So here's an example, a little excerpt from the propaganda film that I mentioned earlier. And this one is of the orchestra, of course, because I'm focusing mostly on the music. Karel Ansel is conducting the orchestra, and it's one of his original compositions that he wrote for the orchestra. And we're just going to take a brief listen to it. And this is the point at which I think, listening to the music and seeing the musicians is important, but I'm much more captivated, I think, by the reaction that I'm seeing from the audience members. And you can hear that the musicians are quite accomplished. I mean, these were very famous, very well-educated musicians that were part of this orchestra. The next example that I'm going to give you is footage from the end of Hans Krause's opera for children, Brundebar. I'm going to get to my notes here. So the Nazi regime used Brundebar as propaganda to portray a positive image of the camp and its Jewish prisoners. The Nazis aimed to deceive the International Red Cross and the world about the true conditions of the camp, showcasing this vibrant cultural life. Despite the Nazi manipulation, Brundebar also took on a symbolic meaning for the prisoners as a story of good overcoming evil and the children's struggle against Brundebar, who many saw as representing Hitler. They altered the ending of the opera for the Theresian performances, which reflected the prisoners' understanding of what was truly at stake. So some of you might be thinking, actually I'm going to go back to that slide because I wanted to point out, they actually made posters for a lot of the performances and even programs for the performances, and you might be thinking, well, why would they be allowed to do that? Well, again, it's just a false sense of security. We'll give them materials to let them do, to have their fun, so to speak, and we know what's going to happen to them in the end anyway, so let them have their fun while they can, and will be entertained by it in the process. So we do have a lot of these really interesting artifacts from the video footage from the propaganda film, and then also many of the programs and posters of these events that somehow survived. So one more story of Terezin before we move on to Auschwitz. And this is Ilse Weber, who was a Czech poet and musician, and she and her husband, her entire family, were sent to Terezin. Actually, their oldest son, they were able to ship to, I think it was Switzerland, to a family member there, but their youngest son ended up going to the ghetto with them. And Elsa was employed during her time at Terezin as a nurse in the children's ward, and she snuck in her mandolin, and she would compose and write poetry in the nighttime shift and then sing to the children during her time there. Her husband had been transferred to Auschwitz a few months beforehand, and she voluntarily asked for her and her son to be transferred there as well because she wanted to keep the family together. And they went ahead and transported her and the entire children's ward directly to Auschwitz, and when they immediately arrived, were sent to the gas chamber. The piece I'm going to perform for you is a piece that she wrote entitled Vigala. If I can get to the next slide, I'll tell you the lyrics. She was obviously a singer, so I won't be able to sing the lyrics for you, so I'll tell you ahead of time what the words say. And I'm only going to give you the first and the third verse. The first verse, Betty bye, byre, the wind plays on the lyre. He's playing sweetly in the reeds, the nightingale sings in the meads. Betty bye, byre, the wind plays on the lyre. And then there's the second verse, but I want to share the third verse because the last sentence of this poem is what really grabbed me the first time that I heard it. Betty bye, blighing, the world in stillness lying. No sound disturbs your rest and peace. My baby huddle in your nest. Betty bye, blighing. Why is the world so quiet? And to me, there's different translations of that last sentence, but this translation really sounds to me like she's questioning why the world is not doing more to help them in their circumstance. Doing research on this particular piece and on her story, I did run across documentation from the BBC that corroborated this claim that somebody had overheard her in the gas chamber singing to the children while they were being executed. I think I was going to grab one down here. Thank you. So this is a performance of Vigla by Ilse Weber. So now we're going to talk about Auschwitz. Go back one. My computer is not cooperating today. I apologize. Here we go. So, of course, most of us have heard of the infamous Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is the largest of the death camps that was part of the Holocaust and the great plan of extermination of the millions of Jews. And we have a picture here of the platform, the sorting platform, and you can see already just the chaos that ensued as these transports were coming in and people were being sorted and not really understanding what was happening when they arrived. As I mentioned before, a lot of the camps and ghettos had orchestras, and Auschwitz was no exception. They had, I think it was a total of 6 different orchestras, including the women's orchestra that's listed, or that's shown here in the bottom photo. The upper orchestra is a men's orchestra. I don't have any identification of anybody in that particular one or its designation, but the bottom one, this was an all-female orchestra that was very famous during this time. It was led by a violinist who's standing here next to the piano on the far left here, Alma Rosé, who is the niece of the composer Gustav Mahler, and she was a very famed violinist. Now, the orchestra was already in existence when she arrived at Auschwitz, but she came in and was able to take it to another level and really bring the orchestra to its full potential. We also have in this picture the mandolin player at the far right here is believed to be, and I'm hopefully going to pronounce her name correctly, Masha Pierkowska, who is, her mandolin is actually on exhibit at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and was dedicated to the museum by her children, who found the mandolin in a closet after she had passed. And they actually didn't know that she had even played in the orchestra until they found the instrument and then started putting the pieces together. So it's impossible to tell because none of the pictures that exist, the copies of the pictures, are all very gritty, but they do believe that this is her. And then we also have in the background, seated in the far back center, the cellist Anita Lasker-Wallfish, seated with the cello. And you're going to hear from her next and her personal story about arriving at Auschwitz and how music saved her life.
You arrive in Auschwitz, then you are taken to a block, a special block, where people shave your hair and tattoo a number on your arm, and this is all done by prisoners themselves. So I have a conversation with this girl who was processing me. And of course she asked me, so what did you do before? What did you do before you were arrested? And I said, I used to play the cello. Then he said, you play the cello? Fantastic, you'll be saved. By that time I was naked, without hair, with a number on my arm, not a very pretty sight. But I can say, I think without hesitation, that it saved my life. Music can't be destroyed, you know. The Germans have destroyed so much, but music is indestructible. Dr. Mengele wanted to hear the Träumerei by Schumann, which I happened to be playing. His job was to go to the trains when they arrive and look for twins and take them to his laboratory and experiment on these twins till they were dead. So a man who did that knew about Schumann. This is the big mystery about these top Nazis. How is it possible that totally normal and so-called educated men can sink to such a level? So when people ask me how do I feel about it, I don't feel anything about it other than think about how obscene such a situation is. It did not spoil Schumann or the Träumerei for me.
So, and I believe that's her son that's playing cello during the interview, because I think she doesn't play anymore. But the last composer story that I'm going to share with you is that of Leo Smit, who was another Dutch composer. He was raised in a mainly secularized family in which there was hardly any connection to Jewish tradition. He left school without a diploma to study music, first the piano at the music school and later composition with Sem Dresden at the Amsterdam Conservatory. In 1924, he was the first in the conservatory's history to graduate cum laude in composition. And early on throughout his career, his orchestral works were performed by the Concertgebouw Orchestra. He briefly taught harmony and analysis at the Amsterdam Conservatory, but in 1927 he moved to Paris to broaden his musical horizons. The connections with the Netherlands remained intact, and he received many lucrative commissions. He also wrote music for film, a new genre at that time, and an industry still in its infancy. Unlike many of his Dutch colleagues, Smit didn't have to deal with the daily struggle to survive. He married in 1933, and the couple lived in a chic apartment near the Seine, opposite the Eiffel Tower, and were financially supported by their wealthy families. He frequented all kinds of musical events and had inspirational encounters with all of the big composers of the time, including Darius Milhaud and Erwin Schulhoff. Just before the war broke out, his career came to a halt. His works were no longer being programmed in either France or the Netherlands, and eventually he moved back to Amsterdam. His compositions written between 1900 and 1943 reflect his significant loss of freedoms, including his flute sonata. In November 1942, he and his wife were forced to move into the deportation district of East Amsterdam. And in March 1943, they were summoned to the Jewish theater, from where they were transported to Westerbork. By the end of April, they were then transported to Sobibor, where they were murdered immediately upon arrival. His musical style is undoubtedly French, although he loved jazz music and often quoted Gershwin in the same style of Milhaud. His earlier works sound very carefree, but after 1935, his musical palette became much darker, more serious, and communicative, including this flute sonata. Only 4 of his works were published during his lifetime. This one did not receive a premiere performance until, I don't have the date in front of me, but it remained unknown until I think it was 2015, when the Dutch flutist Eleanor Pangemeer was given the manuscript and gave the premiere performance of it during that time. His girlfriend, or I guess a friend of his, was a flutist at the time, and so he'd given the manuscript to her, and she just kept it in her possession because she just couldn't afford emotionally to part with it and just couldn't perform it herself. And so eventually it became part of Eleanor's collection, and we have this beautiful, hauntingly beautiful piece now in our repertoire. By the way, I want to mention that all the music that I have showcased here today, none of this is in the traditional canon for flutists to learn. I didn't know of any of these pieces or any of these composers before I started doing this research. And my research is specifically looking for the role of music in the Holocaust, but how it pertains to flute music. There's so many other compositions and composers out there for various instruments that I have not mentioned and that I have not put into my research. And I always feel guilty about that because it may be a really beautiful piece of music, but I have to restrict myself just because of time to finding flute music. And I know that there's other people out there that are working on orchestral music and piano music and string music, but I'm hoping, that through this research that flutists will become more aware of this really wonderful collection of music that we are not taught about in school, and use it as an opportunity to learn about this history. Before I perform this last work for you, it's the second movement of Leo Smit's flute sonata, and it's probably one of the most hauntingly beautiful and poignant pieces of music that I've ever heard. I'm going to be doing it unaccompanied, even though it's written for flute and piano, because I think the melody itself still works as a flute solo. And it's, again, this idea of somebody being able to write such a beautiful piece of music under the circumstances under which he was being forced to live. And this was the very last composition that he wrote before he was transported to his death. I want to end this presentation by thanking the Zeckelman Holocaust Center for inviting me to give this presentation today. And I also want to say, in conclusion, that there have been many criticisms by scholars highlighting the existence of music in the Nazi camps and ghettos, not basically telling us not to talk about it because they feel that it somehow downplays how horrible the conditions were for the prisoners that were in these camps and ghettos. And while I agree that the topic should be presented thoughtfully and with full context, I also believe that talking about the Jewish prisoners choosing to create beauty behind walls of horror only underscores their struggle for self-preservation, their acts of defiance, and the unbreakable human spirit of the countless musicians and artists who suffered and were killed during the Holocaust. So with that, I'm going to conclude with the second movement of Leo Smith's Sonata for Flute, written in 1943.
That was beautiful, Christy. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. Wow.
Thank you for having me.
I was just thanking Christy for the really beautiful, beautiful work. We're going to come now to the Q&A portion of the program. I would encourage all of you to think if you have a question you'd like to ask. I would ask that if you have a personal story to share, Christy's going to be at the reception. You can certainly share it with her there. So I'd really ask for questions that people would like to ask. If you have a question, if you could raise your hand. We have, we're going to use the hand mic. Christy's going to, if you'll raise your hand, we'll bring questions, a microphone to you. We'll hold the mic. You can get your question asked. James, there's one in the back. I'm going to start with the first question, though. How did you get interested in this in the first place? Where did you grow up?
So yes, I grew up in Arkansas, and the majority of my education is the University of Texas, and now I live in Nebraska. So I actually didn't know much at all about this, aside from what I shared at the beginning, until I got invited by the Samuel Bach Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. It's been about 2 years ago now, to curate a music series to accompany their lecture series. Samuel Bach, as was mentioned at the beginning of the program, is a Holocaust surviving artist and is still living and has an amazing array of contemporary artwork, that most of which depicts his experiences and witnessing things that happened during the Holocaust. So anyway, I was invited to do the curation of the music for this lecture series. And so my students and I carefully would pick a piece to go with each of the 10 lectures that were being presented that semester, either the music tied to the lecture itself, or we would find a piece of artwork in the exhibit for that semester and have a piece of music that was tied to that. And the curator of the museum there, her name is Alex Cardone, and she invited me to give the final lecture, which gave me about 9 months prep. And I told her, I was like, I'm happy to do it. I just don't know anything about this topic. But I'm really excited to dig into this and see what I can find. So that's how I actually got involved in this research. I was already doing a lot of research and performances based on banned and censored and persecuted composers, some of which included music by musicians of the Holocaust, but I wasn't taking that deep of a dive into this topic until that invitation. And it's been a really transformative journey for me. I don't see it ending anytime soon. As I was saying at lunch, I'm planning on going sabbatical in the spring and going over to Europe and visiting some of the archives that still have manuscripts that haven't been published, and hopefully we'll discover even more music that's out there. So.
All right, thank you. All right, James, you have a question over here for someone? Someone had their hand raised?
No, I wanted to ask what you asked.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. So I'm sorry I stole the idea. If someone else has a question, otherwise I'm going to ask another one. James, you have somebody there?
Know how the music was saved from the war.
Yeah.
Yeah, it varies from person to person and circumstance to circumstance. Sometimes if the person survived and they just kept their manuscripts with them, some composers actually kept all of the music in their head, and then after the war were able to write it down. The ones that didn't survive, sometimes they would pass it off to somebody else at the camp or somehow smuggle it out of the camp to a family member or a friend to be trusted with it. Very often, some of these manuscripts have been found in people's basements or attics, and they didn't know what they had until somebody had passed away and somebody was going through the boxes and found, manuscripts. So it really depends on the individual story. Some of them ended up in museums and in libraries, and like I just alluded to for my next part of the research project, going to some of these archives, because a lot of these, I shouldn't say a lot, but some of the archives have literally boxes of music that have not been gone through, and they haven't been published. So, yeah, I think that answers your question, but it depends on the circumstance.
Another question. I wanted to ask you, see if I can get back to it quickly. In one of the earlier the drawing that you showed from Camp Vogt, there are a couple of what looks like Nazis in the background, but it looks like mostly it's prisoners.
Right.
Do you know how, were these performances in Camp Vogt done for the Nazi officials, for the prisoners, or combination? Do you know anything about the?
It looks to me, just from this particular drawing, that this one was probably for the benefit of the prisoners themselves, but of course, they weren't just let to be
Right.
on their own
So it would
without
have been
supervision.
supervised
So-
by the prison.
Yeah, and I'm sure that the guards also, enjoyed being there for these performances as well. But this particular one, I don't know for sure, but just based on the photo, I'd say it's probably for the prisoners and not. Yes.
Yeah, the guards, right. So that's what Christy was saying, that there would have been some supervision of the prisoners. They wouldn't have probably let them do it.
Yeah, and like I said, this performance was also, or I assume this one was performed across the loudspeakers as well, but the one for the solo flute, which happened a week later than when this painting was made, was broadcast over the speakers. And so they were allowing everybody in the camp to benefit from the performance, from hearing these performances.
Okay, any other questions we have from the audience? Okay. Oh, Irene has a question over here, James.
I am curious if you have a base of knowing the different reaction you get from Jews and Holocaust, the different reaction to your presentation, to the images and music you get from Holocaust survivors or from the public that isn't even Jewish.
Irene
so the
herself as a survivor, I think she has a vested interest in the question.
Yes, and I actually don't have statistics or have made any kind of delineation of that. I've certainly talked with some Jewish patrons and also survivors who have come to this presentation. So I'd be interested in hearing feedback directly from survivors about what they feel about this presentation. And I also welcome, additions. Or critiques if there's something that you feel like I've misrepresented. So I'm very open to, any information that I can get, but I haven't had I haven't really drawn that line between the reaction between Jewish audience members and non-Jewish members. I will say that doing this presentation at universities for college students and even for some high school students, I've done this as well, and I've always been particularly amazed and inspired by the feedback that I get from those age of audience members, because I've had several people come up to me who have been very compelled to want to then use their artistry to help create a narrative about different topics, whether it's the Holocaust or whether it's what's happening in the world today with war and equal rights and all those things. So,
Thank you.
I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you on that.
We have one last question here from Fred.
I'm curious. Here you were hanging out in Texas, and this school in Nebraska says, "Yo, are you a curator by training or a musician by training?"
Yeah, so I'm a musician by training. I have all three of my degrees, bachelor's, master's, and doctorate in flute performance, flute specifically. I'm also a piccolo specialist.
Little side
Yeah, a little
hustle.
side thing. That's actually
Little
how I
side
made my
hustle.
career, was as a piccolo specialist. That's how people know me. But so the university system, just really quickly, they usually do, if it's a full-time tenure track position, they invite people for interviews. And I was one in 2002. I was one of 100 candidates that was brought in to interview for that job. And so I won that job in 2002 and been there ever since. So I had
Thank
to
you
look
so
on the map
much.
to see where Nebraska was. I wasn't sure.
I want to thank you again, Christy, really, that sharing the history and your music with us. Thank you. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. We're grateful for your presence, your support. Your support facilitates our ability to put on events like this. And if you're not a member here at the center, our staff is available to tell you about the benefits of membership. Before we head into the lobby, I want to invite you to our next event on July 24th, Thursday, July 24th at 7 p.m. I hope you'll join us for our opening of our next special exhibit, whose paintings are of Boris Laurie, a Holocaust survivor, whose avant-garde work illuminates the harsh connections between his personal but also collective history. The executive director of the Art Foundation is going to join us for conversation at that event, Stephanie Stebich. You can learn more on our website, all of our programming at holocaustcenter.org, and I invite you now to join us in the lobby for continued conversation. Enjoy your afternoon. Safe travels home.